The cry in the darkness. The forest of Arcanus was alive with sounds that did not belong to any place a sane person would willingly walk into at night. The branches curled in twisted arcs that clawed at the black sky while strange insects shrieked with metallic cries. The air itself smelled of iron and sap, a mixture that carried the weight of both life and death. Into this hostile wilderness walked a lone human named Rylan, a traveler who had grown used to the edges of civilization, a man who preferred silence to chatter and solitude to false company. He carried a small pack, a knife and the weariness of 1,000 lonely miles. He had not expected to hear a child's voice here, not in this place that swallowed the sound of life whole. The cry came sudden, sharp, cutting through the night like a blade. It was not human, though the words it spoke carried a strange familiarity. "Human, help," it pleaded in broken translation. My mother has fallen. Please, human." The desperation inside the voice pierced him deeper than any weapon could. Rylan froze in his steps, heart pounding, his mind torn between disbelief and instinct. He had wandered the wilds long enough to know that many voices could be tricks. Yet there was something raw and uncalculated in that cry, something that spoke of real pain, real fear. Against the instinct to ignore it and continue his lonely path, he turned toward the sound. Through the tangle of roots and shifting shadows, he saw her. A child, though alien by every measure of shape and form. Her skin glimmered with faint luminescence, scales like tiny fragments of starlight across her cheeks, eyes wide pools of liquid silver that reflected the moonlight. She stumbled forward, small hands clutching at the air as if to seize the very hope she cried for. When she saw him, truly saw the tall human stepping from the darkness, her trembling lips whispered again, "Please, my mom's foot, the trap, she is bleeding. You have to come." Rylan had seen many strange things in his years beyond Earth, but he had never seen a child plead so nakedly. His chest tightened in a way he thought he had long buried. He crouched low, meeting her wide silver eyes, and for a moment neither human nor alien mattered. There was only the universal cry of a child desperate to save their mother. "Show me," he said. His voice low, steady, a voice that tried to hold back the tide of fear rushing from her tiny frame. She wasted no time. Turning, she darted through the twisted roots, her glowing skin casting faint glimmers of light against the suffocating dark. Rylan followed close behind, his boots pressing into the damp soil, his hand tight around the hilt of his knife, though he hoped he would not need it. The forest shifted as they ran, branches snapping, unseen creatures scattering, whispers echoing in a language older than memory. The child stumbled but did not fall, her determination carrying her further than her fragile body should have allowed. At last, they came to a clearing where the smell of blood was thick in the air. The sight struck Rylan like a hammer to the chest. A woman lay collapsed, her leg mangled in the jaws of a brutal trap made of jagged metal and bone. It was a construct of cruelty, designed not only to capture but to shred, to savor the suffering of its victim. The alien mother's skin was darker than her daughter's, her luminescence dimmed by agony, her breath shallow and ragged. She turned her head weakly, eyes hazy with pain, and in them flickered both fear and disbelief as they locked onto Rylan. "A human," she whispered in her own tongue, too weak for him to understand, yet her meaning was clear in the way her hand trembled toward her child. The girl threw herself beside her mother, her voice breaking as she pleaded again. "Please, human, save her, save my mother. She is my everything." Her small hands tried to pry the trap open, but the jagged teeth cut her palms, drawing drops of silver blood. She whimpered, yet refused to let go, her loyalty as fierce as her desperation. Rylan knelt beside them, eyes studying the savage device. He had seen snares, he had seen hunting tools, but this was no mere trap of survival. This was something designed to torment, to make a lesson of whoever dared step into it. And now here was this mother, torn and bleeding, her child screaming to the stars for help, and he, a lone wanderer, standing in the middle of it in that moment. Something old stirred inside Rylan. He remembered a cry from years ago, a voice smaller than this child's, a voice that had been silenced because no one had come in time. The memory burned him, twisted him, and with it came a rage that sharpened his focus. He reached for the trap, feeling the cold bite of alien metal against his palms. The mechanism resisted, cruelly designed to defy strength, but he was human, and humans did not yield to cruel design. Muscles strained, breath hissed. The child's silver eyes locked on him as if her entire universe now depended on his strength. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Predators circled just beyond the clearing, shadows that moved with hungry patience. The alien mother groaned, the child whimpered, and Rylan bared his teeth against the trap's defiance. He pulled with everything inside him, fury and memory blending into one, and the sound of grinding metal screeched into the night. The trap did not yet break. The predators drew closer. The child whispered one more time, her voice so soft yet filled with hope. "Please, human." And in that plea, Rylan knew he could not fail. The savage trap. The forest around the clearing pressed closer as if the very trees hungered for the blood already spilled. The shadow stirred and shifted, alive with the intent of predators that had caught the scent of suffering. Rylan's hands burned from the jagged edges of the cruel device, every tug cutting his skin as the trap bit back against his effort. But the cries of the child beside him kept him rooted to his task. She was no longer speaking words but small gasps of sound, broken prayers to a sky that seemed indifferent, her small form clinging to her mother's arm as though by holding her she could anchor her soul in place. The mother's eyes half closed and fluttered open again, her breathing shallow, each exhale rattling like dry leaves. The trap was more than a snare. It was a declaration of savagery, built by something intelligent but merciless, for it was engineered not just to hold but to shred flesh in a way that prolonged agony, jagged teeth lined with hooks designed to dig deeper. The more the victim struggled, Rylan shifted his grip, forced his shoulders down and dragged against the mechanism. His muscles trembled as the metal shrieked, refusing to yield easily, but humans were never built for surrender. He thought of the way humanity had climbed mountains that tried to freeze them, crossed oceans that tried to drown them, and risen into the void that tried to suffocate them. This trap might have been alien in design, but cruelty was not new to him. Cruelty was something humanity had stared in the eye for centuries and overcome. With a roar torn from somewhere deep in his chest, he heaved, the hinges groaning as one lock snapped, the sound echoing like thunder in the clearing. The alien child gasped, her silver eyes glowing brighter with sudden hope, and she pressed her face against her mother's chest, whispering that help had come. Yet the trap did not release fully. The mother's leg was still pinned, flesh torn and blood pooling in the earth. Rylan knew he needed leverage, something to pry open the remaining clasp. He scanned the clearing, saw a fallen branch thick enough to serve, and snatched it up, jamming it against the cruel hinge. With a grunt, he forced his weight against it, his teeth grinding as the wood bent dangerously. But at last, with a screech, the trap cracked wider and the mangled leg slipped free. The mother moaned, half-conscious, the child weeping into her arm in both relief and terror as her small hands tried to press against the bleeding wound. The metal had torn deep, shredding muscle, and every beat of her heart spilled more of her glowing blood into the dirt. Rylan tore strips from his own shirt, pressing the fabric hard against the wound, wrapping the leg tight in a crude bandage that would at least slow the flow. He knew it was not enough. He knew infection and blood loss would still claim her if he could not move her, but it was the only choice in this moment. The forest hissed around them, the unseen predators no longer patient but restless, their shadows slinking closer, their glowing eyes watching from between the trees. The girl looked up, trembling, and whispered a word in her own tongue that Rylan did not understand, but he could feel the fear in it. He scanned the darkness, saw shapes moving low and fast, creatures with hunger etched in every slithering motion. He tightened the bandage, lifted the injured mother in his arms, and though her weight pressed against his bruised muscles, he rose without hesitation. The child clung to his side, her small hand gripping his torn sleeve, her body shaking but her eyes burning with trust. They moved from the clearing just as the first predator lunged, a blur of sinew and teeth, its body like a twisted cross between wolf and serpent, its jaw unhinging wider than natural. Rylan spun, kicking with brutal force, his boots slamming into the creature's head and sending it crashing against the roots with a hiss. He did not wait for it to recover, pressing forward through the dense trees, every step a battle as the undergrowth clawed at him, and the wounded mother groaned in his arms. The girl guided him with urgent cries, pulling at his sleeve, showing him paths through the thicket that he would never have found alone. Behind them, the predators gave chase, their guttural roars echoing as they crashed through branches, driven by the scent of blood. Rylan's lungs burned, but he pushed harder, driven by the thought that if he slowed even once, the creatures would be upon them, and the child's desperate cry would end in silence. His mind sharpened in the way it always did in the edge of danger, focusing not on fear, but on survival. He scanned for higher ground, for shelter, for anything that could give them a chance to regroup. The forest opened slightly ahead to a ridge where the trees thinned and the ground rose steeply. Rylan charged toward it, boots slipping on loose soil but legs refusing to quit. At the top of the ridge he found a hollow beneath a massive tree whose roots formed a crude shelter. He ducked inside, laying the mother down gently against the earth, her face pale but still alive, her breath weak but present. The child collapsed, beside her, clutching her hand tightly, whispering words of comfort even as her own tears soaked the dirt. Rylan crouched at the entrance of the hollow, knife in hand, listening to the hunters circle below. Their snarls rose in pitch, frustration clear as they searched for the scent that had slipped from their grasp. He tightened his grip, every muscle, ready for the fight he knew was inevitable, the weight of 2 lives pressing against his shoulders heavier than the mother he carried. For the first time in years he felt something other than emptiness inside him. He felt a purpose, raw and undeniable. The child had begged, and he had answered, and now he would see it through. The night deepened, and with it the danger grew sharper. The savage trap had been only the beginning. Flesh and steel. The hollow beneath the tree roots held the air of a tomb, damp and heavy with the scent of soil and blood. Yet it was all the shelter they had in a forest that wanted them dead. Rylan crouched near the entrance with his knife tight in his hand, his ears tuned to the snarls and guttural cries of the hunters prowling below the ridge. The creatures were patient, too patient for simple beasts. Their movements coordinated as they tested the perimeter, circling, waiting for weakness. Their glowing eyes blinked in and out between the trees like drifting embers, never too close, never far enough to forget. The child pressed against her mother's chest, whispering words of comfort though her voice trembled with fear, her small body shaking as if the night itself gnawed at her bones. The mother lay pale, her breath shallow, her wound bandaged with strips of Rylan's shirt but still bleeding through, each pulse weakening her further. Rylan's mind churned, weighing choices. He knew if they remained still, the predators would not leave. They smelled blood. They smelled fear, and they would wait until exhaustion and hunger weakened their prey. To move was risk, yet to stay was death. Humanity had survived countless nights like this on Earth, nights when predators howled beyond the firelight and survival was nothing but a question of will. He felt the weight of that legacy now pressing into his chest. He was one man, yes, but he carried the stubborn fire of a species that had stared into darkness and refused to die. He tested the edges of the trap's broken hinge he had dragged along, the shard of alien metal sharp and jagged. Cruel design could still serve survival. He tied it to the end of the fallen branch with strips of cloth, fashioning a crude spear. The wood was rough, the metal uneven, but in his hands it became a promise. The girl's wide silver eyes followed his every motion, and though she did not speak, he could feel her unspoken hope. She had seen him fight the trap, seen him carry her mother, and now she watched him turn broken things into weapons. To her he must have seemed something both frightening and miraculous. The first predator tested their resolve with a sudden lunge up the ridge, its massive body slamming against the roots with snarls that echoed like thunder. Rylan met it with the spear, driving the jagged point into its shoulder. The beast shrieked, a sound that rattled the air. Its blood sprang in dark arcs, and it fell back thrashing into the undergrowth. The others howled in response, their cries merging into a chorus of fury. Rylan did not celebrate. He knew predators, learned, and now they understood he would not be taken easily. The child pressed closer to her mother, whispering again, her voice small but filled with awe and fear. Rylan glanced at her, saw the reflection of his defiance in her gaze, and felt something stir deeper than instinct. He was not fighting only for himself now. He was fighting because a child had called him human and begged for help, because a mother's blood stained his hands, and because to walk away would mean admitting that cruelty could rule unchecked. Hours bled away, each one a test. The predators lunged and retreated, probing the hollow, snarling and hissing when the spear or the knife struck them back. Rylan's arms ached, his palms raw from gripping weapons fashioned in haste, but he held the line. The girl never left her mother's side, her whispers a steady rhythm like a prayer that somehow gave him strength. When her mother stirred and groaned, Rylan felt relief like water in a desert. She was alive still, clinging to the edge of life, but alive. At dawn, the predators pulled back, their cries fading into the distance as the sun's pale light broke over the forest. Rylan did not trust the quiet, but he knew they had won a small reprieve. He looked at the mother, at the way her wound still bled through his crude bandage, and knew they could not linger. Infection would spread. Blood loss would take her, unless he found a way to treat her. He had no medicine, no clean supplies, only the fire of determination that burned in his chest. Humans had mended worse with less, and he would not stop now. He gathered stones and branches, striking sparks with the shard of alien metal until smoke rose and fire bloomed within the hollow. The heat filled the space, driving away the damp, giving the girl and her mother warmth. He took the broken metal from the trap and held it in the fire until it glowed red. The girl gasped, realizing what he meant to do. He did not explain, for explanation would not ease the pain to come. When the metal was ready, he pressed it to the mother's wound. She screamed, her body arching in agony, the child wailing beside her, but the bleeding slowed, flesh seared shut by fire and steel. Rylan's face was grim, sweat dripping, but his hand did not waver. When it was done, the mother fell limp, unconscious, but still breathing, her wound no longer gushing life away. The child clung to her hand, tears streaming, her small voice breaking as she whispered that her mother would live. Rylan sat back against the root wall, exhausted, his body aching from battle, his hands blistered from fire, his mind heavy with the cost of survival. Yet beneath the weight there was something fierce and unyielding. Flesh and steel had met, and he had not let them lose. The predators had retreated, but the forest still whispered of threats, of enemies more cunning than beasts, of the ones who had set the savage trap. Rylan knew the fight was far from over. The long walk of survival, the fire beneath the roots burned low and steady, casting shadows across the faces of the wounded mother and her child, while Rylan sat in silence, his back pressed against the twisted bark of the great tree, his eyes heavy yet his body alert to every sound in the forest above them. The night had passed, but morning light brought no safety, for the forest of Arcanus was a place where danger never slept, and predators only waited for weakness to show. The mother's breathing was steadier though shallow, her wound seared shut by fire and steel, but the child refused to let go of her hand, whispering words of comfort, as if her voice alone could tether her mother's spirit to life. Rylan watched them and felt a strange weight within his chest, a reminder that he had not carried another's fate in his hands for many years until now. The ridge could not shelter them forever. The predators had retreated, but not vanished, and the scent of blood would linger, drawing them back, or perhaps worse, drawing those who had set the trap in the first place. Rylan rose, stretching his aching limbs, and spoke to the child in words she half understood and half guessed, but she seemed to know his meaning. They had to move. They had to walk through the wilderness pressed in on every side. She nodded, her silver eyes wide but steady, her small hands trembling, yet determined. She helped him lift her mother between them. But her strength was little more than hope. So Rylan bore most of the weight, his muscles burning as he carried the alien woman across the uneven ground. The long walk began with silence, broken only by the crunch of soil beneath boots and the rustle of leaves brushing against them. The forest did not welcome trespassers, branches twisted low to claw at skin, vines coiled to trip, and the very air pressed heavy as if alive with malice. The girl walked beside Rylan, her eyes always scanning the shadows, her voice low, as she whispered directions, pointing out hidden paths known only to her people. Without her guidance, he would have stumbled into pits or beneath branches that dripped with venom. Yet with her help, they moved steadily, though every step was paid. For in sweat and pain, the sun rose higher, but its light did little to banish the darkness beneath the canopy. Strange creatures watched from the branches, their eyes glowing, their forms shifting and fading like mirages. Some fled at the sight of Rylan's determined stride, but others followed, lingering at the edges of sight, their patience unnerving. Hunger gnawed at him, his pack nearly empty, his throat dry from the heavy air, yet he pressed on. The child never complained, though her bare, Feet bled on the rough ground, her will to keep close to her mother stronger than any pain. When the mother stirred weakly, whispering sounds that were too faint to carry meaning, the child cried with joy, pressing her cheek to her mother's hand. Rylan felt relief bloom in his chest, though it was tempered with the knowledge that every moment she remained alive was a fragile miracle. He adjusted her weight, shifting her carefully so she would not jolt the wound, and continued on. His own arms burned with strain, but he refused to stop. He had carried burdens before, heavier in some ways and lighter in others, and he knew that survival was not won by comfort but by wills. They climbed another rise. The forest gave way to a stretch of cracked stone where water trickled from the cliffs into shallow pools. Rylan lowered the mother gently against the rock and filled his hands with water, bringing it to her lips. She drank weakly, and the child followed, cupping water in her palms, though most spilled down her arms. Yet her laughter bubbled at the taste of it. A small, bright sound that pierced the heavy silence of the wilderness. Rylan allowed himself the faintest smile and washed the blood from his hands. Though the stains seemed carved deeper than skin, they did not linger long, for the forest whispered with new dangers. The girl froze suddenly, her head snapping toward the distance. She whispered a word Rylan could not understand, but the fear in her voice needed no translation. He looked across the stone valley and saw shapes moving at the far edge. Not beasts, this time, but figures, upright and deliberate hunters. The ones who had set the trap. He felt his muscles tense, his grip tighten on the makeshift spear. They were far still, but their movements were steady, their path clear. They were searching, and soon they would follow the blood trail straight to them. Rylan lifted the mother once more, nodding to the child whose eyes were wide with fear yet burning with trust. She hurried to his side, and together they pressed on, leaving the pools behind and disappearing into the trees. The long walk stretched ahead, cruel and uncertain, every step echoing with the knowledge that something more dangerous than beasts now stalked them. The predators of flesh had tested them, but now came the predators of thought, those who built traps not only to kill, but to dominate. And Rylan knew in his heart that the fight for survival was no longer just against the wild, but against enemies who carried intention. The long walk of survival had only begun, and each mile would demand more than strength. It would demand the unbroken fire of humanity. Shadows of the hunters. The forest of Arcanus grew darker as the day stretched long, its canopy thickening into a ceiling that swallowed the light and left only a dim green glow that felt more like twilight than noon. The sound of the wilderness pressed close, the hiss of insects, the low growl of distant beasts, the steady crunch of Rylan's boots carrying the weight of the wounded mother across terrain that seemed to twist and change with every mile. The child walked at his side, her small hands brushing against the fabric of his torn sleeve, her silver eyes wide and restless, scanning every shadow with the instinct of one who had grown up in a land where every silence could turn into danger. Behind them, the forest no longer whispered with the movement of simple predators, but with something sharper and more deliberate. The hunters had come. Their footsteps were not always heard, but sometimes a snapped branch or a faint metallic rattle betrayed them. The girl would stiffen at those sounds, her voice trembling as she whispered warnings. Though her language broke into fragments, Rylan understood enough. They were being followed, and not by beasts, but by those who had crafted the savage trap. He did not tell her the truth. He already knew that confrontation was inevitable. They would not outrun these hunters, not with the mother slowing every step, and not with the child's legs bleeding from the harsh path. Instead, survival would demand something different. He had no gun, no advanced weapon, only his knife and the spear he had made from broken steel and wood, but humanity had survived with less. He began to watch the forest with new eyes, no longer seeing only the danger but the tools hidden within it. Every root could become a snare, every stone a weapon, every branch a barrier. He collected what he could, while moving vines to weave into lines that could trip, and branches he sharpened with the edge of his knife. The child watched him with a mix of confusion and awe, her small voice finally breaking the silence with a question he half understood. Why, she asked. Why he bent branches, why he pressed stones into patterns, he answered, with one word: fight. She repeated it softly, her tongue shaping the foreign sound until it rolled off her lips with a strange reverence. That night when the sky outside the canopy turned black again, and the forest sang with the restless voices of unseen creatures, Rylan chose a hollow between cliffs where stone walls on two sides gave them protection. He built a fire not for comfort but for control of space, its glow casting light into the dark where the hunters might creep. The child sat, close to her mother, whispering while her silver eyes darted often toward Rylan, watching as he placed sharpened stakes at angles in the ground, tied vines across narrow paths, and arranged stones where feet might slip and break. The hours crawled, and the forest seemed to hold its breath until the first shadow moved against the glow of the fire. Tall, lean shapes crept between trees, their armor jagged and crude, their eyes gleaming with malice. They carried weapons of bone and steel spears, with serrated edges, whips of chain that rattled faintly. One stepped forward, testing the open ground before them, and Rylan felt the air grow heavy with the knowledge that the battle was about to begin. When the first hunter lunged forward, a snarl, tearing from his throat, his foot caught the vine Rylan had laid, and he stumbled forward straight into the sharpened stake, driven into the earth. The point tore into him, and he shrieked, his voice high and guttural as he fell, writhing. The others hissed their anger, rushing from the trees. The child gasped, clutching her mother, but Rylan rose, his body hard and ready. His spear lifted. He fought not with elegance, but with the fury of survival. Striking fast and brutal, each movement guided by instinct honed from years of hardship. He drove the jagged metal into one hunter's chest, ripping it free in a spray of blood, while another slashed at his side with a chain whip. The metal tore skin, but Rylan did not falter, his boot smashing into the attacker's knee, breaking bone with a crack that echoed like thunder. The girl cried out, her voice sharp, as she saw another hunter slip past the fire, crawling toward her mother. Rylan spun, rage surging like fire in his veins. He hurled the spear with both hands, and the crude weapon flew straight, piercing the hunter through the shoulder, pinning him against the roots of a tree. The creature screamed, thrashing but trapped. The others hesitated, their snarls breaking into low growls as they reassessed this lone human who fought with the fury of an entire pack. The firelight painted Rylan's face in harsh lines, sweat and blood streaking across his skin, his chest heaving with breath, yet his eyes unbroken. The child's gaze locked on him, wide with awe, her voice trembling as she whispered the word he had taught her. Fight as if it were a sacred truth. The hunters drew back, circling once more, shadows weaving into the trees. They would not give up. He knew they were too cruel, too patient, but they had felt his strength, and now they would stalk him differently, testing for weakness, waiting for the chance to strike again. Rylan wiped blood from his knife, his stance steady as he watched the dark, knowing the night was not yet over. The shadows of the hunters had closed in, and though the child clung to her mother, whispering in fear, Rylan knew one thing with absolute certainty. Humanity would not bow to shadows. Humanity would fight humanity's fury. The night bled into a darker silence after the hunters withdrew, their shapes vanishing into the trees. Yet never truly gone, for Rylan could feel their presence pressing on the edges of the firelight, like wolves circling a wounded stag. He sat with his back to the stone wall, his knife still in hand, his chest heaving while sweat mixed with blood upon his skin. The child curled close to her mother, whose breath came in shallow pulls, but whose pulse still beat faintly against the small hand that clutched her wrist. The fire cast the girl's silver eyes into twin mirrors of fear and wonder, her gaze often drawn back to Rylan, as though trying to understand what force burned in this human that made him stand against shadows larger and crueler than himself. Hours dragged, and the predators of thought waited patient as the roots of the forest until the pale glow of dawn began to filter through the canopy. The fire had burned low to embers, and the air smelled of ash and blood. Rylan rose, his muscles screaming, yet his resolve unbroken, and he stepped beyond the hollow, scanning the trees. He saw them then, watching from the edges, tall and lean, their armor crude, but their eyes sharp. They did not flee when he looked upon them. They only stared, as if measuring him, their bodies tense with hunger for the kill. Rylan understood that they would not stop. He also understood that running again would only delay the inevitable. The long walk had led them here to this point, and now the fight would be decided. Turned back to the child and spoke in a low, steady voice. She did not understand all his words, but she understood the meaning. Stay. Protect your mother. Do not move." Her lips trembled, but she nodded, clutching tighter at the woman's hand. He gathered. What remained of his makeshift weapons, the crude spear cracked but still usable, the broken metal shard sharp enough to cut, and he wrapped his fists with cloth to guard against the chain whips of the hunters. He had nothing more than the will to fight and the stubborn fire that no trap, no predator, and no night could extinguish. When the hunters came, they did not creep. They burst from the trees with howls and rattling chains, their forms blurring with speed and rage. The first rushed, straight for him. Spear leveled with jagged bone teeth, Ryland sidestepped and slammed the sharpened branch into its side, twisting with the force of desperation and fury. The hunter howled, stumbling before collapsing against the ground. His cry only drove the others harder. Two came at once, one with a whip of bone links that cracked like thunder, the other with a blade of serrated steel. Ryland blocked the whip with his wrapped arm, pain lancing through flesh as the chain tore skin, but he endured, it dragging the attacker close and smashing the hilt of his knife into the creature's skull before spinning to face the one with the blade. They circled him, their snarls filling the clearing. The child screamed when another hunter tried to slip. Past toward the hollow, Ryland felt rage explode inside him, fiercer than the fire that burned in his chest. He charged with a roar, slamming his shoulder into the attacker and driving him into the ground. The crude knife in his hand rose and fell, again and again until the predator stopped moving. His breath came in ragged bursts, his arms heavy, but he did not stop. He rose again, bloodied but unbroken. The hunters paused for the first time, their growls shifting to something like hesitation. They had expected an easy kill, a trophy to mark with cruelty. Instead, they found themselves facing a single human who fought as though the lives of stars burned behind his fists. Ryland spat blood into the dirt and lifted his jagged spear in defiance. His voice thundered across the clearing, his words carrying the raw weight of fury. "You will not take them." They came again, desperate to end what shamed them. Their weapons tore at him. Cuts opened across his chest and arms, but he fought on his every strike, driven not by survival alone but by the memory of a voice that once cried for help and was left unanswered. He would not let it happen again. Not to this child. Not to her mother. Every blow he dealt, every wound he endured was proof of what humanity was. He was flesh, yes, but he was also will, and that will refuse to break. When the last hunter stumbled back, bleeding from wounds too deep to heal the others, faltered their snarls, quieting into uneasy silence. Ryland stood in the center of the clearing, his chest heaving, his body battered, his eyes burning with a fire that would not dim. He raised his bloodied spear one final time, daring them to come again. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The hunters hissed low and retreated into the trees, their shadows melting into the wilderness, leaving only silence and the crackle of dying flames. Ryland staggered back to the hollow, his legs trembling, his arms heavy with exhaustion. The child looked up at him, tears streaking her luminous face, yet her eyes shining with something new. Not fear but belief. She whispered the word he had taught her fight, but this time it was not a plea. It was a truth. She looked upon him not as a stranger, but as something more, a protector forged from fury and will. He sank to the ground beside them, his body broken, yet his spirit burning brighter than the dawn that broke over the forest. Humanity's fury had spoken, and the hunters had learned it was not easily silenced. The echo of a cry, the morning after the battle, was heavy with silence, broken only by the crackle of faint embers and the rasp of Ryland's breath as he leaned against the roots of the tree, his body torn with wounds and exhaustion. His hands trembled not with fear but with the strain of a night spent fighting against death itself. His arms and chest were cut, his blood mingling with the dirt. Yet in his eyes there was no surrender, only the steady fire of one who had endured. The alien child knelt at his side, her small hands trying to press cloth against his wounds, though the scraps were little more than tatters. She whispered words, soft and trembling words he could not understand. Yet the meaning was clear. She was begging him to hold on, as he had begged the night before for her mother to endure. Her silver eyes carried not only fear now, but something deeper. Respect, belief, a bond that no distance of worlds could undo. The mother stirred weakly, her voice faint, but carrying a note of life that had not been there before. The seared wound no longer bled, though her body trembled with weakness. Her gaze lifted slowly to Rylan, and though she could not speak his language, she spoke in the way of eyes and expression. Her look held gratitude and awe for the stranger who had fought not only for survival but for her and her child. She raised a trembling hand which her daughter quickly guided to rest upon his arm, and in that touch he felt the weight of her thanks. Rylan knew they could not remain in the hollow forever. The hunters had been beaten back but not destroyed, and the savage forest still pressed upon them with endless threats. He rose on shaking legs, lifting the mother once more, though every muscle in his body screamed and every cut ached. The child walked at his side, guiding him with gestures pointing toward paths hidden beneath the tangled roots and narrow valleys that only one raised in this land would know. The journey was slow, yet steady. Every step, a test of endurance. Every mile a reminder of how fragile yet resilient life could be. As the sun climbed higher, the forest began to thin, and the air shifted from heavy dampness to something clearer. They emerged into a wide valley where the sky opened and distant structures shimmered in the light. The child gasped, her voice bright with sudden joy as she cried words he did not know, but her tone unmistakable: home. The mother stirred at the sound, her eyes flickering with recognition and hope. Rylan pressed forward, carrying her, though his vision blurred from exhaustion. The valley spread wide before them, revealing towers carved from stone and glowing crystal. A settlement of her people, hidden deep within the wilderness. Figures emerged from the edge of the settlement, their shapes similar to mother and child, tall and luminous, their eyes silver and wary. They froze when they saw him, a human bloodied and battered, carrying one of their own in his arms. Some raised weapons, others spoke quickly in voices sharp with suspicion, but the child broke from his side and ran forward, crying out to them, her voice high and insistent. She clutched at her people's hands, pulling them toward Rylan, and her words, though foreign, carried the weight of her plea. She showed them her mother alive but wounded. She pointed at the human, she cried the word she had learned from him: fight, and she said it not with fear but with reverence. The alien people gathered around their fallen kin, lifting the mother from his arms and rushing her toward the glowing towers. Rylan staggered but did not fall, his legs trembling, his body drained. He expected to see only suspicion in their eyes, but as they looked upon him, they also saw the blood on his hands, not only his own, but the hunter's blood that stained his skin. They saw the wounds that marked his flesh and the exhaustion that weighed on him. Yet they also saw the fire in his gaze, and the way their child clung to his torn sleeve, refusing to let go. When the mother was borne away to healers, the child remained at his side. Her small hand tight around his, Rylan lowered himself slowly to the ground, his body at last giving way to the toll of battle, yet his spirit unbroken. The aliens spoke among themselves, their voices urgent and uneasy, but the child spoke louder, her words sharp with conviction, repeating again and again the single word he had given her. Fight, until it became less a word and more a chant, echoed by others, as their silver eyes shifted from suspicion to something else. By nightfall he sat among them, his wounds treated with strange glowing salves, his body wrapped in their woven cloth. The mother slept nearby, her breathing steady, her hand resting over her child's. The people gathered around, listening as the child spoke, her voice trembling with passion as she recounted every moment of their struggle. Her words painted him not as an intruder, but as a savior who had faced the savage trap, who had carried the wounded, who had fought shadows with nothing but will and fury. Their eyes widened and their voices hushed as she repeated again the word fight, until even the elders spoke it softly, as though it had always been their own. Rylan did not seek praise nor worship. He sat quietly, his gaze fixed on the fire, his thoughts drifting to the cry that had first called him in the darkness. A cry he had once failed to answer in another life, but which he had answered here. He knew his path would carry him onward, that he was not meant to linger forever, but he also knew that the echo of this cry would live long after he left. It would live in the heart of the child who had called him human, It would live in the people who now looked at him not as an outsider but as proof that humanity's fire could burn even in the coldest of worlds. And as the night deepened, Rylan closed his eyes not to sleep, but to rest in the knowledge that for once the cry had been answered, and that answer would echo into the stars. The echo of a cry. The morning light spilled across the valley like a river of fire, painting the jagged trees in gold and red, and stirring life back into the broken land. Rylan sat against the roots of an ancient trunk, his body heavy with wounds, his muscles raw from battle, yet his spirit still burning. He felt the weight of silence pressing around him, not the silence of danger, but the silence that follows victory, the silence of survival. The alien child knelt at his side, her eyes wide silver and filled with something that had grown larger than fear. She pressed her small hand against his arm, her voice trembling as she whispered sounds he could not understand, but her tone was clear. Gratitude, belief, hope. The mother stirred nearby, her eyes fluttering open as she turned toward him, weak but alive. Her gaze spoke what words could not. She knew she had been carried from the edge of death by a stranger who had chosen to fight not for reward or glory, but because a child had cried. Rylan forced his battered body to rise. He lifted the mother once more onto his shoulders, ignoring the scream of pain that tore through his bones, and followed the child who led them through twisting paths between stone and shadow. The forest thinned and the air grew clearer until the land opened wide before them. A valley stretched toward the horizon, marked by crystalline towers glowing softly like stars fallen to earth. The child gasped, her voice ringing with joy as she cried out home. Her cry carried through the valley, and figures emerged from the edge of the settlement, tall and radiant with wary eyes and ready weapons. They froze when they saw him, bloodied and broken, carrying one of their own. Their hands tightened on their blades, but the child ran forward, her voice high and insistent, pulling them toward the human. She clung to his side and cried the word he had given her, fight, again and again, until the sound seemed to echo across the valley. The bear. People gathered around, taking the wounded mother from his arms, lifting her gently toward the crystal towers. Their eyes shifted between suspicion and awe as they looked upon him. His body was a map of wounds, his hands stained with blood, both his own and that of the hunters. His chest rose and fell like a storm, yet his eyes still burned with unyielding fire. The child would not release his sleeve, her small fingers digging into the torn fabric as though letting go would undo everything they had endured. Her voice trembled, but she spoke louder than the elders, repeating her story, how he had answered her cry, how he had faced the savage trap, how he had carried her mother and fought the shadows with nothing but will and fury. She repeated the word fight until it became less a word and more a truth. That night he sat among them, his wounds wrapped in glowing cloths, his body cradled by the strange warmth of their healing fires. The mother slept nearby, her breath steady, her hand resting gently on her child. The people surrounded him, listening to the child's tale. Her words, turning into a chant, echoed softly by their voices. They looked upon him no longer as an intruder, but as something greater, a reminder that humanity's fire could burn through fear and darkness. Their silver eyes reflected his flame, and their silence was no longer suspicion, but respect. Rylan did not seek their worship. He sat quietly, gazing into the flames, remembering the first cry that had reached him in the night. A cry that once would have gone unanswered, but now had been met with a fury that would echo beyond this place. He knew his path would carry him onward, that he was not meant to stay among them, yet he also knew the echo of that cry would never fade. It would live in the child who had called him human. It would live in her people who now whispered his word, fight, as if it were always theirs. It would live in the stars, waiting for the next time humanity was called upon to prove its fire. Rylan closed his eyes, not to fall into weakness, but to rest in the knowledge that the cry had been answered, that a promise had been kept, and that no shadow could silence what had been born in this valley. His breath slowed, and the fire warmed his face, and as the stars gathered above the people around him, spoke the word, fight not in fear but in reverence, the end.